We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara and Aleph and Mesechet Shekalim. This is Shekalim Daf 13a. The Gemara in the previous Amud was discussing Rabbi Eliezer's position in the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer said if a person is makdash his property and there are ophos, there are birds among the property, we assume that the person's intention for Kadshay Mizbeach was to bring Karban Ola, so you sell the birds and you use the money for Karban Ola. And the question is, why don't you just bring the birds directly for Karban Ola? And the Gemara even asked, based on Rabbi Yochanan's understanding of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said if a person is makdash a nekeva as a Karban Ola, so even though normally you don't bring a nekeva as a Karban Ola, there is an element of kedushas haguf that is chal on the animal. And Rabbi Yochanan explained that opinion of Rabbi Shimon, that the reason there's a kedushas haguf that's chal on the animal is because there is an animal that exists that can be brought as a Karban Ola that's a female, and that of course refers to ophos, to birds. So the Gemara was asking, look, you see, even when it comes to other animals, female animals, where normally they can't be brought as a Karban Ola, there's a certain kedushas haguf that is chal based on the fact that an oaf can be brought as a Karban Ola. And yet Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah doesn't even allow you to bring those very same ophos that are part of the person's property as a Karban Ola. It seems like a contradiction. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Kayamtia Kahad Amar Rav Shmuel B'Shem Rav Zeira. Our Mishnah, the position of Rabbi Eliezer, follows the statement of Rabbi Shmuel in the name of Rabbi Zeira, which says as follows: Kol she'ena yichola likarev. Anytime you have an animal that cannot be brought, lo hi v'lo dameh. You can't bring the animal itself. We'll see why you can't bring the bird itself, and you can't redeem the animal and use the money to bring the same carbon. Lo kidsha ela hekdesh damim. The halacha is then the animal does not become kadosh. There's no kedushas haguf in the animal, except what we call again a kedushas damim. In other words, it's kadosh for the value purpose. So then you sell the animal and you use the money for the purpose that was intended. And as the Gemara now elaborates, Viata Amrit Yos, you now say correctly, Lahakrivo einat yachol. You're not able to bring the birds as a Karban Ola, Techsib Babakar, because again, the pasuk said specifically with the cattle. In other words, when a person just is makdish ophos stam, so we darshan that doesn't apply to ophos. It only applies to bakar. It says babakar v'lo ophos. The halacha that when you're makdish stam, you bring them as karbanos, that applies to the bakar, but that doesn't apply to the ophos. And lifdoso einat yachol. And when it comes to redeeming it, you can't redeem the ophos either. She'ein la'of pidyon, because the halacha is there is no redemption of birds. By other animals, you have a concept of redemption because there's a concept of a mum and redeeming the animal with a mum. You don't have such a concept by ophos, so that's why when it comes to ophos, you're not able to bring it as a carbon. You're not able to redeem it. Lafum kain. Therefore, tzarich meimar lo kitcha la kedushas damim. We're forced to say when this person is makdish stam, his property and ophos are among the property, the intention was only kedushas damim and nothing more. And the Gemara continues, Chavraya b'shem Rabbi Yochanan. The Bnei Chabura said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And Rav Ivo bar Nagri Amar Kumi Rabbi Ela. Rav Ivo bar Nagri said in front of Rabbi Ela, b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, as follows: Taima dehain. The reason of this particular Tana. This is a reference to the position of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda that we had before, that if a person is makdish a nekeva, a person is makdish a female for any of the karbanos that a female cannot be brought. That means whether it's a karban ola, whether it's a karban pesach, whether it's a karban asham. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, there was no kedusha whatsoever. It's not osa tzmur. There's no kedusha saguf. Where does he learn that out from? He learns it out from the following. Taima dehin Tanya. He learns it out from the following brisa. V'im kol behema tameya asher lo yakarivu mimena karban la'Hashem. Pasuk here, simple pshat of the pasuk is, it's talking about a person takes an animal that is a tamei, an animal that is not kosher, and the person tries to make a carbon. So the halacha is, as the pasuk says, the person needs to redeem the animal. The person needs to do a pidyon. When it comes to a behema tamei, you can do a pidyon even if the animal does not have a mum. But the Gemara now darshans, ma tamad lomar tameya. What does the pasuk over here say? Tameya, the idea is it's an extra word. It really already discusses behema tameya in another pasuk. What is this extra word tameya coming to include? Ela afilu tameya ba'osu Hashem. It's talking about exactly the situation, even if it's not actually tameya, but the point is it cannot be brought as this particular carbon. So exactly our case. You have an animal that cannot be brought as an ola, as an asham, as a carbon chatos, because it's a female. That's exactly the case over here, and that's exactly what it's saying. There's no kedusha whatsoever, just like a real behema tameya, where there's no kedusha at all. Obviously, it's not roy for the mizbeach at all. So too over here, it's just a kedushas damim. But the Gemara says that's very difficult. V'kasha b'doksiv v'hamid v'herich. Gemara says that's a difficult pshat, because what does it say in the pasuk? It says v'hamid v'herich, meaning it's talking about the fact that the Kohen evaluates the value of the animal, and then we do a redemption process. Now that makes sense if the pasuk is actually talking about a behema tmeya. But for the pasuk to be talking about an animal which is really royal mizbeach in general, an animal that's a female that cannot be brought as this particular carbon, but can be brought as another carbon, so you never redeem such animals when they don't have a mum. So vehemid veherich doesn't fit. So to say that the word tameya includes even a female animal in this particular scenario does not make sense. So the Gemara offers another drasha. Rabbi Zira b'shem Rabbi Lazar lo amarkein. Rabbi Zira in the name of Rabbi Lazar didn't say the above drasha. Ella, rather, he said it as follows: V'im kol behema tameya asher lo yakrivu mimena karban l'Hashem. Again, the same pasuk says, by a behema tameya you try to be makdish it. So what it really means is kol she'eno roi likarev lo kan v'lo b'makam acher eno osa tmura. What it means to say is, if you have a situation where the animal can never be brought in any situation as this carbon, then there's going to be no kedusha saguf. Yatzas nekeva la'ola, but that excludes a nekeva, a female animal, as a carbonola, because afa b'she'eno roi likarev kan, even though it can't be brought as a carbonola, a female animal cannot be brought as an ola. Roi likarev b'makam acher, but a female bird could be brought as a carbonola. In other words, according to this second understanding of the drasha, the Gemara, the pasuk is specifically talking about trying to be makdish in a keva as a carbon asham or a carbon chatas. In those cases, that's when we say that there's no kedusha whatsoever. There's no kedusha saguf at all. But if you're trying to be makdish a female animal as a carbonola, then actually there would be a kedusha saguf. And the Gemara continues and asks on this explanation as well. Rabbi Avon v'Rabbi Bon ba'on kumi Rabbi Zeira. Rabbi Avon and Rabbi Bon came in front of Rabbi Zeira, and they asked on his drush as follows: Hare haroveya v'hanirba. What about animals they have that are roveya? They're nearby. They're involved in improper relations. She'einon ru'uin likarev. Those animals cannot be brought as karbonos. Lo kan v'lo b'makom acher. There's no scenario where roveya and nirva can be brought as karbonos. Exactly the same as when you're trying to be makdish in a cave as an asham or in a cave as a karan pesach. There's no scenario where that is kosher as a carbon. However, v'harein osin tmura, but in those cases there is tmura, meaning there is some kedushas haguf in those cases. So you're trying to say that in all cases where it's not royally kare b'makam acher at all, so then it's not going to be osa tmura, but that's not true. We find cases that are osa tmura. So Amar lo, and so he said to them, Afani lo amarti ela tmea mamish. Said actually the drasha that I just said previously, you misunderstood it. What I really meant was only if you have a situation to understand the pasuk kipshuto. Only if you have a situation where you have an animal that's really tameh, completely forbidden, then in such a situation, that's when we say that there's no kedushas haguf, it's only kedushas damim. V'kasha b'doksiv v'hamid v'herich. And the Karban Ha'eda over here has a slightly different girsa. He writes, Behodoksiv v'hamid v'herich, meaning, in a case where you have a behema tmeya mamish, that's actually the only case where this pasuk makes sense, as we said before, because by a behema that's actually a tmeya, you're allowed to redeem the animal even when it does not have a mum. So that's exactly the case the pasuk is talking about. A person tries to be makdish a behema tmeya, then it's v'hamid v'herich, then the Kohen evaluates the animal and they do a redemption. But again, in all the other cases, roveya, nirva, nikeva, and all types of karbonos that an animal can't be brought as a nekeva, in all of those cases there is a kedusha saguf, and it is osa temura. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Achas l'lamed yom misharin es halishka. Once every 30 days, they used to set the prices for the lishka. What this refers to is that the Beis HaMikdash used to buy from suppliers. They used to buy wine, oil, they used to buy flour, and they would set the price every 30 days. This is the price we're paying. And as we're going to say, the Yad Hekdesh is always al halyon. They always have the upper hand. So in other words, if the market price goes up, they follow the price they set at the beginning of that 30 days. And on the contrary, if the market price goes down, Hekdesh actually gets to pay the lower price. That's what the Mishnah says here. Kala mekabil olav l'sapek siltos me'arba amdu mishalosh yisapek midalit. For example, let's say a person agreed to supply flour to Hekdesh, and they were going to sell it for 4 saw for a selah, and now all of a sudden it is 3 saw for a selah. They have to give the 4 saw for a selah. They have to go by that original price. But in the other direction, mishalosh v'amdu midalid. So then also Yisafik Midalid. Let's say now all of a sudden the price goes that you can get 4 saw. Originally they were only going to give them 3. They set the price at 3 saw for a selah, and now it got a little bit cheaper and you can get 4 saw for a selah. They still have to give the 4 saw for a selah. Sheyad Hekdesh al Halyona. The general rule of the Mishnah is the position of hektish, they have the upper hand, and therefore they always take the lower price. So you're setting the price every 30 days, but it's always to hektish's benefit. And furthermore, along the same lines, hisliya soles, hisliya lo. Let's say something goes bad, worms appear in the flour, the loss goes to the supplier. Vim hechmitz yayin, hechmitz lo. If the wine goes bad, that loss goes to the supplier. And eino mekabel ma'osav ashrihei hamizbech meratza. The Mishnah finishes off that the person who's accepting the money, he's only accepting the money until the mizbech is able to use it, until the mizbech is meratza. In other words, even though the person supplying it accepts the money and it seems like the deal is over, the deal is not over until hektish was actually able to successfully use the items for the mizbeach. Otherwise, hektish is allowed to say the sale does not go through, and again the supplier takes the loss. And the Gemara says, Tani b'shem Rabbi Shimon, it was taught in the name of Rabbi Shimon, miyad hayu mekablen es mosein. Immediately, the people supplying these ingredients to hektish, they would take the money immediately, and they weren't afraid that something would go bad with the flour, with the wine. They weren't afraid. Why? V'hakohanim's reason, they weren't afraid because the Kohanim were very careful. There was reason. They made sure to protect the items and use it, and that way it would not spoil. It would be used in a proper state. In other words, the point was the people who were supplying the items to hektish had confidence, since the Kohanim was reason, that the Kohanim would protect everything and keep it in good condition. Hadron aloch parak hatruma. This is the conclusion of the fourth parak of Mesechet Shekalim. If you're enjoying these videos, please take a look at the description box below to see how you can support this channel. And also, please like, share, and subscribe. And we will now continue with the fifth parak of Mesechet Shekalim. The Mishnah says, Elu hein hamamunim shahayu b'mikdash. The following were the families that were appointed over the various jobs in the Beis HaMikdash. This is talking about at the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash. Yochanan ben Pinchas al ha-chosamos. First, there was Yochanan ben Pinchas. He was in charge of the chosamos. The way the chosamos worked was, let's say somebody needed to buy nesachim. He needed to buy wine for the libations. So he would go to Yochanan ben Pinchas, he'd give the money to Yochanan ben Pinchas, and Yochanan ben Pinchas would give a chosom, would give a seal to the individual, and then, as the Mishnah continues, Achia ala nesachim, the person would bring the chosom to Achia, and Achia would actually be in charge of the nesachim themselves, and he would receive the chosom from the person, whatever was written in the seal, how much the person is supposed to get, kind of like a receipt. He would receive this receipt, and then he would give the nesachim to the particular individuals. Now, the reason why they had to sell the nesachim, they didn't sell, for example, animals that were sold as karbonos, those you could buy on the marketplace. The reason is because the nesachim could be makabel tumah, so they had to be protected properly. So those were sold under the auspices of the Beis HaMikdash. Masha Einkein, that was not so when it came to the animals. And the Mishnah continued, Masya ben Shmuel ala Paisos. Masya ben Shmuel was in charge of the lotteries. They used to draw lots 4 times every day in order to decide who would do what avoda. Pesachia al Hakinin. Pesachia was in charge of the kinin. That refers to the birds that were brought by Zavim and Yolados. In those situations, a person who was chayiv to bring kinei chova, a person who was chayiv to bring birds as a carbon, would bring the money to the shofaros in the Beis HaMikdash, and the people who were in charge of the shofaros, they would take the money and they would bring on their behalf, they would bring the karbanos, and the person who was in charge, again in this case, was Pesachia, and as the Mishnah says, Pesachia zeu Mordechai. Pesachia actually refers to Mordechai from the story of Purim. V'lama nikra shemo Pesachia. Why was he called Pesachia? Shahaya poseach devarim v'darshan. He used to understand. He had a certain understanding of things, and he could darshan. V'yodeya b'shivim lashon, and he knew 70 languages. So Mordechai was referred to as Pesachia. And the Mishnah continues, Ben Achia al Chole Meyayim. Ben Achia was in charge of Chole Meyayim. In other words, he was like the doctor, because since the Kohanim, they used to eat a lot of meat, they used to walk around barefoot. A lot of times their stomachs would give them difficulties, health issues, so they would need a doctor. So again, this Ben Achia, he was the doctor. Nechunya Chofer Shichin. Nechunya was the person in charge of the digging of the pits and the wells for the water. This was the water that was around for the Oli Regalim, so people who would travel up to Yerushalayim would have water on the road. Gevine Cruz, Gevine was the announcer. He would announce every morning that the Kohanim should begin their avoda. He would encourage everybody to begin the avoda. Ben Gever al Ni'ilas Sha'arim. Ben Gever was in charge of the gates. He would be in charge of appointing people in the morning to open the gates, in the evenings to close the gates. Ben Bavi Memuna al HaPekiah. Ben Bavi was in charge of the Pekiah. The Pekiah refers to the wicks that were used in the menorah. The wicks needed to be made very very precisely so that they would burn for the proper amount of time. Ben Arza al Hatzilzel, Ben Arza was in charge of the cymbals. The cymbals were used as it was a musical instrument that got them started, that got the Levium started when it came to singing in the Beis HaMikdash. Hugras ben Levi al Hashir, Hugras ben Levi was in charge of the singing in the sense he was able to begin the song, and when he began the song, everybody would begin along with him. When he would conclude the song, everyone would conclude with him. Beis Garmo al Maisa Lechem Aponim, Beis Garmo was in charge of making the Lechem Aponim. Beis Avtinas al Maisa Ketoras, Beis Avtinas was in charge of making the Ketoras. We've mentioned Beis Garmo and Beis Avtinas previously in the Mesechta. Elazar al paroches. Elazar was in charge of the paroches. Let's say they needed to make a new paroches or fix the paroches. Upinchas hamalbish. Pinchas was in charge of the clothing of the Bigdei Kahuna. Again, in situations when those needed to be prepared, that was done by Pinchas. Now, of course, all the families that are listed in the Mishnah were only serving for one generation. They didn't serve throughout the entire time of the second Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara now has a machlokus regarding that issue. Rabbi Chizkiya Amar Rabbi Simon v'Rabbanan. There's a machlokus, Rabbi Chizkiya in the name of Rabbi Simon and the Rabbanan. Chad Amar Ksheirei Dor V'Dor Bolimnos Alein. One opinion says that in this Mishnah we're listing the best over all the generations. In other words, the most kosher family that served in this position throughout the generations of the Beis HaMikdash, that's the one being listed in this Mishnah. In other words, all of these different families in the Mishnah did not necessarily serve at the same time. We're picking out prominent families in the various positions. The Charna Amar, the other opinion, says as follows: no, Mishahaya ba'oso dor mone masha bedoro. It was specifically the one in the original generation that we're listing. All of these served right at the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, and then they appointed new ones as the generations proceeded. All of the people in the Mishnah did serve at the exact same time. And for these last lines of the Amar, we're going to read here the Girsa of the Gra. The Gra says as follows: Hachi Garsin and Tamon. The Gir says as follows: Tamon Taninon. Over there in the Mishnah in Yuma, we have the Mishnah says as follows: Al Rishonim Nemar Zecher Tzadik Levracha. On the first of the list, it says Zecher Tzadik Levracha, meaning these people are tzadikim. Ve'alelu Nemar Shem Risham Yirkov. And on the later ones in the list, they are considered Rishayim. That's what the pasuk says: Shem Risham Yirkov. What's going on over there, Mesechet Yuma, is it's listing again very similar to this Mishnah, various people who are appointed over different things in the Beis HaMikdash. So it says, for example, it says Munbaz HaMelech would make all the yados of the kalim of Yom Kippur out of gold, and Vahayu Maskir no son l'shevach, he's mentioned l'shevach, and then the Mishnah continues a list of families that are lignai, and some of the lists are actually in our Mishnah. So, for example, Beis Garmo, they didn't want to teach the Lechem HaPanim to other people, and it says Beis Avtinas, they didn't want to teach the Maisa Ketoras to others. Hugras ben Levi knew the Shir, didn't want to teach it. Ben Kamzer didn't want to teach the Maisa Ksav. And then the Mishnah says that on the first part of the list, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, those are tzadikim, and on the later part, it's Shem Rishayim Yirkav. So the Gemara here is quoting that Mishnah, and now trying to put that together with the machlokas we just had in this Mishnah, where it talks about the possibility that everyone in this Mishnah is the Ksherim B'chol Dor V'Dor, is the best of all generations, including the families that are listed in Yuma as the ones that are Shem Rishayim Yirkav. So that's what the Gemara says. Madamar Ksherei Dor V'Dor Balimnos Aleim. According to the one who says that in our Mishnah everybody's considered the Ksheirish B'chol Dor V'Dor, the best of all generations, including Beis Garmu, including Beis Avtinas, so hu omer Zecher Tzadik Levracha. Then you're going to have to say that the Zecher Tzadik Levracha in the Mishnah in Yuma goes on them as well. Really what they did was appropriate, as the Gemara will explain. Man da Omer Mishahaya Ba'oso Dor Moneh, but the one who says that our Mishnah is just listing people in that particular generation, so Ma'asha B'Doro, whoever was in his generation, Al Mi Nemar Zecher Tzadik Levracha, so then the Zecher Tzadik Levracha only goes Al Ben Katin V'Chaver of Kain Sarach Lomer. That goes on Ben Katin V'Chaver, meaning it doesn't go on these families that are listed in our Mishnah, because they're not necessarily Ksherim B'chol Dor V'Dor, and the Gemara will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis.